Elections are an expensive business in India. The Election Commission, which has to conduct them, and the government, which has to provide the infrastructure so that close to 100 crore people can cast their vote. But it's also an expensive process for political parties and candidates. Now, the 2019 election was the costliest in Indian history. An estimated 55,000 crore, something like $8 billion, was spent on conducting these elections. Now, in 2017, the government moved a finance bill to introduce electoral bonds that would bring in a new source of finance for political parties to fight elections. And today, the Supreme Court has banned those electoral bonds on the eve of the 2024 elections. Now, who funds elections and how elections are funded across the world? And most importantly, what is going to be the fallout of the Supreme Court verdict? Joining me to discuss this are Aradhya Sethia. I want to start by asking Aradhya. Aradhya, I've read your paper on the electoral reforms. Did this come as a surprise to you, today's verdict by the Supreme Court?
Yes, from the grapevines that you hear about what could be a likely outcome, it was a surprise in that way. But I do agree with the outcome. I've argued in my paper that there were serious constitutional issues and perhaps better ways to finance as well. So, principally, I don't think it's a surprising outcome, but it was surprising because we were not expecting that the court might strike down a few months before the elections.
Right. Ashok, how significant is this verdict today, and how does it alter the finance, say what's going to happen in 2024, the finance that political parties are going to be counting on?
Well, as far as I see it, I think it's a huge setback to the government of India. And more importantly so, because it comes just a couple of months before the country goes to a general election.
Yes.
So everybody was geared up for these electoral bonds, and this was the only route to finance political parties. But you have to understand one thing, as far as corporate financing is concerned, it's been the lifeblood of all political parties in India since 1947.
Yes.
There have been certain changes in between, where at one point in time the government of India brought in a law totally banning corporate funding.
1967.
69 actually.
69.
That was the
Mrs.
time
Gandhi's
when
government.
the Congress party had split.
Yes.
And then subsequently Rajiv Gandhi bringing in a law reintroducing corporate funding. And the most important element when corporate funding was reintroduced was that they kept a ceiling. There was a cap on the amount of corporate funding that can happen to a political party, and it was fixed at 7.5%. At one point in time it was 5%, then it was increased to 7.5%. So till 2017 that was the rule, that there shall be a 7.5% of the total profits of companies that can be given as political funds to parties. Now, this judgment, as I see it, does a very important job of balancing the right to information and the right to privacy. Because what was argued in this case was that the people, the donors, the companies had a right to privacy. They had a right to keep their information confidential, hidden. On the other hand, there is a right to information of the voters. So the court was called on to first recognize that whether this particular scheme, electoral bond scheme, was violative of right to information or not. And the second thing it was called on was to balance these two fundamental rights. And the Supreme Court rightly holds that this right to information is in larger public interest.
Yeah, important point. And Aradhya, this is a point that you raised in your paper as well. I remember reading this thing about how this was unconstitutional in a way, the fact that the anonymity of the donors, that was a contentious point, and the Supreme Court seems to have highlighted exactly that. But how does this now change the way elections are going to be funded, you see, in India? Is it going to be back to the days of the suitcase Raj as we knew it in the 70s and the 80s?
Yes, I think so. That's an excellent question, and I think that's the big question going forward once we move beyond Supreme Court and the law, right? So electoral bonds are, of course, very important, but at the end of the day, they are a very small part of the overall political funding system in India. We don't know exactly where all political funds come from, but my guess would be there would be a small fraction of total political funding that goes in India.
Right.
Now, there could be better ways of designing it. So Supreme Court, while striking down, actually looked at some of the alternatives.
Yes.
So one alternative, for instance, is electoral trust, right? Why did you require electoral bonds? You required it because many corporations, many companies feared that the opponents of the political parties they're donating to might harm them, right? So what electoral trusts, which were brought about after 2010, the broad idea in electoral trust is that a company might give money to electoral trust, and electoral trust donates to the parties. So public and the parties will only come to know which trust has donated to which party, but they wouldn't come to know exactly which company has donated to the party.
Yes.
So it broadly at least helps voters to relate which electoral trust has funding from which company and where it's going to the party, but it also sort of provides some anonymity to the company. So I should state that anonymity in Indian context is important. I don't think we should easily discard that public's right to information is the only balancing factor, and Supreme Court takes into account. But there could be alternative ways where at least the big donation, the larger sort of amount of donation is revealed, or maybe one step revealed as it happens in electoral trusts. While electoral bond has complete anonymity, while parties come to know ultimately who is donating to them. If you are making a huge donation, you will not hide it from party. The point is to let party know that we are donating it to you.
Right. But this point, Ashok, this point that Aradhya raised about anonymity, that's so important in India because of fear of political reprisal. In fact, it could be a case in any country in the world. But why is it that electoral bonds were chosen as a way out of this?
See, what the electoral bond scheme did was basically to implement that scheme. There were changes which were brought in 3 other laws. One is the Representation of People's Act, the Income Tax Act, and the Companies Act. As far as the Companies Act is concerned, they said do away with the ceiling. Do away with the fact that only a profit-making company can make political donations. They said even a loss-making company can do it. The second thing was Income Tax Act. In the Income Tax Act, they said that the donor and the donee are entitled to income tax exemptions. So they can claim income tax exemption. The donor can say, I have made this donation, and the political party said, I have received it. So the donation is exempt from income tax. The third was Representation of People's Act. Under the Representation of People's Act, the change was that, look, when you don't have information about who donated what to whom, how can you make that disclosure? So that disclosure was done away with. So the point here is that you tried to make in the beginning, that what happens after this particular judgment. We are back to pre-2017 regime, which is, you rightly said, the suitcase regime, where people, because primary source of funding for political parties is either by individual donation or corporate donation. These are the only 2 methods of funding that we know. Individual has a limit to make a donation, but big corporate houses can make huge donations. Now, after this scheme has been scrapped, we are back to 2017 era, where parties or corporate houses will be making donations in cash. That is, cash is black money, unaccounted wealth, and that will be pushed into the electoral system. Now, the government of India said that, look, why we introduced the electoral bond scheme was to deal with this menace of black money. We want to reduce this. However, if you want to reduce this, you have to look for other ways. That is what the court is saying. You just cannot curb the right to information of a citizen, a voter, to know who's made that payment. You should have adopted another way. Now they were only confined to testing it against Article 19.
Aradhya, what are the global best practices that we can look at? Now, given that this scheme is scrapped and there is a intention to kind of streamline political funding, it happens across the world. Could you just run us through how it works in the rest of the world? Campaign funding in the United States, for instance, of course, it's an individual party, it's an individual candidate thing. But what are the global practices that can be looked at for India if we want to kind of move ahead on this?
Yes. So before I move to global practices, I should make sure that where India is in some way special or different. Before I say what the lessons are, we should also take those lessons with a pinch of salt.
Right.
And the difference is the kind of economy we have. It has nothing to do particularly with a party or elections. It's the kind of political economy we have. And probably over time, we'll formalize our economy. A lot of our economies, or at least used to be cash-based, and still a huge part of economy is cash-based. And when the economy is cash-based, it's difficult to see how the money flows. It flows like water. You close one door and it will find one way.
Right.
So that's the underlying feature of broad Indian economy. Doesn't matter what regulations you make. If it's broadly cash-based, you wouldn't even know the way political money travels. Now, once we take sort of that rider into account, that difference into account, there are three main things that any political funding regime has to decide. One is the contribution, right? Who can contribute how much? Because that decides who can influence politics, at least to a large extent. Money can't win elections by itself. That you need many other things to win elections, but it is an influencing factor. Second, which India completely lacks, and my argument would be that if we really want to control political funding in India or finance in India, we should think about this aspect, which is expenditure.
Right.
So we are currently only talking about contributions. We are not even thinking about expenditure, especially party expenditure.
Right.
There are limits on candidate expenditure. We all know they are often flouted.
Yes.
It's much easier to actually, in my argument, it would be easier to enforce party expenditure. Why? Because you have fewer entities.
Right.
You only have, unlike thousands of candidates, you have maybe 50, 100 major parties at least who you can enforce against. We don't audit political parties. There's no external audit. There is audit, but there is no independently enforced audit, right? So if we don't control expenditure, then parties will have incentive to be in an arms race, expenditure arms race, right? And in India, there's just no control over expenditure and auditing of independent auditing of parties. Now, the third thing is what we are mainly concerned about here is the transparency, right? Now, clearly, after this judgment, we have at least legally, formally, a strong regime of transparency to some extent. But as I said, all these things together contribute towards making each other important as well. So we can't just have transparency and have a huge cash-based economy, because you can have great transparency laws, but ultimately, if the donations are made in cash, how do you really enforce transparency without putting sort of some enforcement mechanism in every nook and corner of the country, right? During elections, which is of course very costly. So all these components together sort of make a good political funding system. Now, across the world, there are broadly contribution limits that the countries impose, or there are expenditure limits, right? Where you just try to control total expenditure parties can have. Now, I am currently in the UK, I'm sitting in the UK, and if you ever come here and see the elections, you would see how low-key it is in some ways. And the reason is that because it's the expenditure is very tightly controlled. So if parties don't have to enter into arms race to win elections, because expenditure is tightly controlled, contributions become a secondary factor, and at least that's my view.
Right, absolutely. A very important point there, Aradhya, that Ashok, this thing of that he mentioned, Aradhya's point about it not being so much about campaign funding as much as it is about campaign expenditure, and we know how obscenely political parties spend, and you know, it is a rich man's game at the end of the day, politics. Does this alter anything, the Supreme Court verdict today?
Well, it doesn't really alter anything, because even in India, we have this law under the Representation of People's Act. There is a cap on the expenditure by a party or by a candidate. As far as the candidate is concerned, it's 75 lakhs. And for the party, on one seat, it's 90 lakhs. So what really happens is that despite having a control on the expenditure, we have seen for the last 7 decades that you cannot control it. Now, there is a particular candidate who could make an expenditure of 75 lakh rupees for his polls, but there could be people around him who will still spend money
Who will still spend.
for the
Absolutely.
candidate.
Yes.
So how do you control that?
Right.
So it's a pretty complex issue, and this matter has garnered the attention of various government committees from time to time.
Yes.
Even the Law Commission of India applied its mind to it. They thought about state funding of elections.
Yes.
They've also thought about various mechanisms to control the spending of a candidate on campaigns by saying that there could be particular ads which could go free in the print media or in the electronic
Right.
media, the airtime, and they have made recommendations. But
None of which have been implemented.
none of them have been implemented, because the government in power will choose a methodology
Yes.
which will suit their ends.
Right, absolutely. And that's the whole point of it, isn't it? But thank you very much, Aradhya, for your observations, and my colleague Ashok's thing about the electoral funding being struck down, the electoral bonds being struck down by the Supreme Court, a very historic verdict. But as our panelists have just told us, that's just part of the problem. The elephant in the room, which is the obscene amount that's spent by political parties, expenditure, that has yet to be tackled, and it seems that that's not going to go out of the window in a hurry. Thanks for watching.
Streaming on News9 Plus. News is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.